Kieran Gilbert, our Chief News Anchor and, of course, host of Afternoon Agenda, is here in the studio with me. You're in the defence lockup today. What was your take, first of all, on what was outlined today?
Well, in simple terms, Tom, this is the unclassified report that's been released. It's about sharpening the definition of the threats facing our country, and it's about sharpening the response. So if you listen to the 5 elements of the risks or what we need to factor in, the second one, I think, and the third go to the core shift in our defence outlook. This is, secondly, to deter through denial any adversary that may seek to project power to attack Australia, essentially, or our interests through the northern approaches. And the third one, to protect our economic connection to the region. So these are the two sharpened definitions, I believe, in terms of what our defence outlook is. And in terms of the sharpening of the response, it is about what you said, that projecting of force. And basically that comes down to the ability to have a long-range strike capability from missiles. That's the number one response. Of course, we know the submarines is part of that,
yes.
But the big part of the DSR, this Defence Strategic Review, is to bolster the number of missiles. So sharpening the threat in terms of the definition and sharpening the response with more missiles and those subs that you alluded to.
That went partly to, the capability and the change to the Army. A few things: a reduction in infantry fighting vehicles, I think from a number in the 400s to 120 or so, but reprioritising that money. So willing to say we're not going to spend the money on this program, spending it on more longer range strike capability instead, so that, when we're talking about projecting off our shores, instead of a 30-kilometre ability, we're talking about 500. Also talking about the fact that, again, and this is the willingness to go into elements of, okay, where should we not be spending money? The Army is the last resort for national disasters, which is quite interesting, right? Because increasingly that's where it's being used, both here and abroad. Great asset to have, but it's a tighter budgetary situation. There's a lot spent on defence, and we don't yet know what the alternative is. If we're not spending the money on this, and we need help for natural disasters, the PM was asked about this and didn't want to go into it, there needs to be something there in its stead, right?
Well, first of all, on that point you made about the Army and potentially the view among some out of this will be that the Army's capacity might have been diminished by the reduction in those armoured vehicles. Now, it was put to me privately in this briefing that we've just come out of before that news conference is that it's not diminished because of that long-range missile capability that you talk about. There's also an enhanced amphibious capacity that the review is committed to.
Landing equipment they spoke about, so if you're landing somewhere else... Essentially, yeah. Instead of having all these vehicles that work once you're there, it's getting them there. That's the logistical nightmare.
So it's a boost
warfare,
to
right?
the amphibious or landing capacity, a boost to the long-range strike capacity, making it a more lethal force, that Army. Now, Tom, on that other point that you made, this is a very interesting one. It's page 41 of this report. It says, climate change holds a number of significant implications for defence, and essentially the acceleration of climate risks overwhelming the government's capacity to respond effectively and detracting from defence's primary objective of defending Australia. Defence must be the force of last resort for domestic aid to the civil community. This is critical given the urgent risks that the nation faces in our region. Now, to me, that's fine, and you can use it as a last resort or in extreme circumstances. But what about those floods? They were extreme circumstances. We needed defence.
And how many more extreme circumstances will you get as a result?
And who else has got the capacity to respond?
So do you have a wing within? Is it more work from reserves, perhaps? I don't know, reserves role has been looked at. That's the unanswered question.
Or as the Prime Minister was asked, it didn't really like the question, but at the civil capacity to do essentially what defence does. Because defence...
And a state and federal government combination, perhaps.
You might need that because at the moment, in extreme circumstances like those floods, defence were the only ones who could do it. In fact, the Prime Minister at the time said, why didn't Morrison call them in earlier? So it's fine to say you need to use them less, but you need an alternative.
But politically, that's the first thing that politicians and federal politicians in particular can say, we've called in the Army, we're taking this seriously. So whilst it's an option, you'll always see leaders and ministers lean on that, right?
Absolutely. And on that point, it says here whether the government's agreed to the recommendations on that one, whether the army is used as last resort, agreed in principle.
Okay, so watch this space. The other thing you mentioned was unclassified. So we're not going to see in this references to China or indeed invasion of Taiwan, but what we did see referenced was removing the so-called 10-year horizon, as in the potential for trouble or trouble is coming, and it's we've got a bit of time we don't really have much time anymore. Everything we need in this capability is as soon as possible. And there was an allusion by Pat Conroy to some of these projects to saying, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we can get 80% of something delivered and then improve on it, let's do it, rather than have these defence projects, which, it's where money goes to die, it's where timelines go to die normally as well.
And that is, I think you've nailed it in terms of the fundamental driving force behind this. That warning time of a decade that we previously assumed, that's gone. And one of the people who has provided advice to governments over years is Professor Paul Dibb. He's going to be joining me this afternoon. He was there in the lockup today. Professor Dibb is one of my guests to analyse this. Also, I've got the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles is my guest this afternoon as well, just after 2 o'clock. So, make sure you join us for that.